All right. So, are there people watching this live, or are we?
Yeah, people are coming in.
Very cool. Um, so should I start right now then? Sorry. um,
Actually, we can wait a couple minutes.
Raoul's in the chat. My name is Paul Scott. I'm a senior studying computer science here at Penn State. So today we're going to be talking about Angular, which if you're not familiar with what Angular is, it's a web development framework. So I would say it's similar, not exactly, but it's similar to something like React. They're actually, Angular and React are sort of competitors to each other. And this idea is it's a web framework that allows you to build very powerful web applications. Um, and an advantage is, of course, you're not using just plain HTML, CSS, JavaScript. It has tricks up its sleeve that make the development process a lot easier and more intuitive. So without further ado, I'd like to start off by showing. So what we're going to do first is install Angular. And so what you're going to need to do to install Angular is open up terminal window. So if you're using Windows, you're going to need to open Command Prompt, and make sure if you're opening Command Prompt, you right-click the executable and run as administrator, because that's going to be important for installing Angular on your computer. And then if you're running Mac, you can open Terminal, and whatever command I'm going to show. Well, actually, I'm using Mac, so you'll see how I do it on Mac. But for Windows, you're going to type in exactly the same thing I'm typing in, except just in the command prompt. So the first thing you need to do, if you have not already installed Node.js, is that needs to be installed before executing any of the commands I'm about to show, because it's actually like running Node.js commands. So just first off, make sure that that is installed for you. And so let me just really quickly show my screen. I'm going to get my terminal screen up. Oh, I don't have sharing permissions.
So I just gave them to
There we
you.
go. Thank you. Okay. So does everybody see my screen? Does everybody see my terminal window? So hold on. Okay, awesome. Okay, so assuming that we have, assuming that you have Node.js installed, the command that you're going to be typing is pretty simple. It's going to be, and I'm not going to complete it just because I already have it installed, but it's going to be npm install g. That G flag stands for global, so it installs it on your entire system. Angular at CLI. Oh, I'm sorry. The that's typed in a little bit wrong. That's what it should be. Okay, so this is the command that we use to install Angular. Now, once again, I'm not going to be running this because I already have it. If you're on a Mac, when you're using this global flag, you need to make sure that you run that as a super user. So, you can prepend it with the sudo command and then just type in your password. If you're on Windows, Mac, I mean, if you're on Windows, when you're running this command, you just need to make sure that the command prompt is open as an administrator. If you don't know how to do it, like if you just search like CMD in your Windows search, and then like the first option that shows up, you want to right click it and just choose run as administrator. And then you can just type in the command without, just as it is right here. Okay. So it's going to take a little bit to install. It shouldn't take a whole lot of time though. So once it's installed though, we actually want to start creating our Angular project. And so when you install this package, it gives you a new command called ng. Ng that's just Angular's command And you can see here's a lot of the available options, add analytics, but the one we're going to be first concerned about is new. So how to generate a new project with Angular. Now, some IDEs, existing IDEs are smart enough that they give you options to automatically generate an Angular project without having to do any of this command line stuff, but I still think it's good at least to know how to use the command line to generate a new project, because it can come in handy. So what we want to do is in the location where we want our project, in this case, I'm just going to put it on my desktop. We want to type in the command ng new, and then followed by the name of our project. So I'm just going to call this project workshop. Hit enter. So you'll get a couple options when this happens. You just want to accept all of the default options. So no, just keep hitting enter, and then eventually it'll generate the project. This shouldn't take too long. So all it's doing is just generating the required files, and there's a lot. So it's not actually, although there are a lot of files that get generated, it's I'll show you sort of the overall file structure of an Angular project, just so you guys, it's not overwhelming, because it really isn't. The Angular file structure is pretty intuitive. All right, still on installing packages npm. So, and I'll explain actually why this is taking a long time. I know what it's trying to install right now, but Angular, I think projects by default give you a lot of existing dependencies on other packages, so it's just taking its time installing those. Okay, so it just generated. We don't need the command prompt anymore, so we can just exit out of that. So now let me share my screen. So now what you want to do is open up your preferred IDE of choice. I will be using Visual Studio Code, but you can feel free to use something else. Like if you have WebStorm installed by by JetBrains, that's also a really good option. But what you want to do is you just want to open so wherever you generated your project, I generated it on my desktop. So I'm going to open that, and let me, after I open that, share my screen with that. Okay. Okay, and can everybody see VS Code? Okay, awesome. So over here, this is the root directory of our project. You can see there's 3 folders: E2E, node modules, source. For our purposes, source is really the only one we're going to care about. That's where all of our code is going to be going. All of these are just setup files. These package JSON files are just all of the Node.js package dependencies for the project. But we're not going to be touching these. These are all sort of, we can use command line commands to modify these without actually having to go into them. So when we open up the source folder, we can see that there's 3 other folders, and we also have a bunch of other files. So we have this app folder, assets folder, and environments. And we'll only be worrying about these 2, the app and assets folder. The app folder is where all of our app code is going to be going. The assets folder is where, like, if we have image dependencies, which we do, I posted that drive link earlier. That's where we're going to be putting our images. So that's where you put just non-code assets go in the assets folder. We also see here a couple pretty important files, index.html. If you're already familiar with web development, this is the root of the project. But we actually really aren't going to be touching this file all that much. The only real reason you'd want to modify the index.html in an Angular project is like if you want to change the title, if you want to change the favicon, which is the little icon that shows up on the tab in a web browser. So we would only be modifying this head data, but we would really don't want to be touching anything down here. This is where our app is going to get injected right here, at this app /root. And so we really don't want to do too much with this file. But this is where, this is equivalent to the index.html file we're all familiar with from web dev. We also have a styles.css file. And these are for global stylings. These are for the styles for your project. However, you're not putting all of your stylings here. And I'll go into detail why that isn't the case. But these are stylings that are shared throughout your entire application. And so if you have a style that's only for a specific part of it, which I'll show in a second what that means, you don't want to put the styling here. So let's go into the app folder, which I already mentioned is where we're going to be putting our code. And you'll notice that we already have some generated files here. We have, and the only ones we really care about here are these three, the app.component, CSS, HTML, and TypeScript. So Angular uses this idea of something called a component. And what a component is basically a set of three files, which are an HTML file, which is used for the layout of the component, CSS, which is used for the styling of the specific component, and then the TypeScript file is used for the functionality of the component. So you notice it uses TypeScript. Angular uses TypeScript. It's very, very similar to JavaScript. It's really just a typed version of JavaScript where you can specify the types of variables. And that's what Angular uses. And so the idea is that a component has all three of these. This spec.ts is just for testing purposes. We're not going to be using it. And the app module TS keeps track of all of our existing components and any sort of imports that we put into our project. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to show off is generating a new component. So what we want to do is, if you're using VS Code, VS Code has a terminal that you can just bring up from the bottom, or you can just open another terminal window from your computer if you prefer. So the first thing we're going to do is generate our new component. Now, what's important here is we're in the root of our workshop. We're in the root of our project right now. So like if I list the directory, we can see we're in the root folder. So what we're going to do is use another Angular command, so ng, and it's called generate. Now, the next thing we need to do is tell Angular what to generate, because it can generate more than just components, but we want it to generate a component. So I'll specify component, and now we're going to give our component a name. So how I sort of did this is we're going to start by making a header for just like, how websites have like just a header. We're going to make one of those. So ng generate component header, and we see it gets generated. So if we look in our app folder, we can see that it generated this header folder right here. And if we expand that, we see 4 files generated. So there's our HTML, our CSS, and our TypeScript. We can also see this test file, but once again, this isn't important. So we're just going to ignore that. But we can see it generates just a string of text that says header works. The TypeScript is pretty bare, and there's nothing in the CSS. So it's very empty. So the question is kind of how do we write a component? Like, so when we're writing the HTML for a component, we only in its HTML file, we only want to write its HTML. So, if you were writing like the sort of old way to do web development, and you just had one giant index.html file, you would be writing the code for your header inside of the index.html. It would be sort of a part of that HTML file. But this time, it's sort of separated out. And so we're only going to be putting the HTML for our header and nothing else. And so that's sort of the idea of a component, is it's sort of an independent thing, that it has its own HTML, its own CSS, its own logic. And so this really allows us to kind of do some really powerful things with Angular. So let's make a really simple header. I'll first create a surrounding div, and I'll just call it header. Okay. So that's a pretty simple header. We just put in a div. I haven't put any stylings yet, so let's go to the CSS file. I'll do header. The stylings are I'm just going to put my own stylings here, but they're less important. So let me make it for M in height with 100%. Because it's a header, I want it to be fixed to the top of the screen. That should hopefully do it. And just so I can see it, I'm going to just give it a background color of red, although that will change. Okay, so now the question is, how do we actually use this? Because if we run this project now, which I haven't yet, and I'll show you how to do that in a second, this header, our component won't show up. And the reason being is because we haven't added it anywhere. So it's not going to show up. So what we need to do is go into our app component HTML. So this is sort of, you can think of the app component HTML as the root of our project. So this is where we'll actually be adding all of our HTML. All this here is just auto-generated, like initial code. We can delete it entirely. We don't need it. So now what we want to do, excuse me for a sec. Now what we want to do is we want to add our header. So whenever we create a component in Angular, to access the component, we just do, like any tag. We start it with app, then a dash, and then the component name. So in this case, it's header. And we'll save that. So now our project has our header. So now we need to actually see our results. We want to run this project. So unlike normal web development, we actually need to compile. Compile may not be the right word, but we need to actually compile some of the code so that it forms an entire web page. So it takes our components and basically generates HTML for your web browser. So what we want to do is in the terminal, once again in our root directory, we want to type the command ng serve. And what this is going to do is it's going to compile what we've written. And then eventually it's going to push the changes to a port on our local host. So we can see here. Okay. So we can see it says compiled successfully, which is great. So what you'll see here, it says your Angular live development server is listening on localhost 4200. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy localhost 4200. I'm going to open my web browser. I will share that on my screen in a second. Let me just make sure that that's working fine. Okay. Let me change. I'm just going to share my desktop so I can switch between the two. Okay. So this is the result that we get. And you can see here now, ignore this sort of weird styling, but here's our header, right? So it's just a bar up top, background spread. If I want to make things a little nicer, because CSS is weird, let me go into the style CSS. You don't have to do this. It's just for my own sanity. There we go. For some reason, like, I don't know why they have default values for border margin padding in browsers, but they do. That's why it had that weird padding over there. Okay, so we have our header. So let's expand it, obviously, because this doesn't really have anything in it. So what I'm going to do is let's put like a title in the header. So once again, we need to go back to our header component. I will give it the title Hack PSU Spring 2021. I'll save that. There's our text. Let's make it look a little nicer. I'll give it font size 36 pixels, font family, Arial. This is superficial. It's just sort of stylings. Okay, that's good for right now. I don't need this to be perfect. And let's make this gray instead of, okay. So we see here we have our header component here, and it has our logo or just a string of text here. But obviously this isn't much a very useful website. So obviously we're going to need to add some content. So what we're going to do is generate another component the exact same way. So One thing to note about this ng-serve command is as you make edits to the code as the ng-serve command is running, it will automatically recompile and push your changes to the local host. So you don't need to keep rerunning that command. You can just run it once and it will, it'll update automatically. So that's a really convenient feature about Angular. So we want to keep this terminal, this ng-serve terminal window open. So I'm going to open a new one. And so we're back at our root directory. So I'm going to generate another component, and I'm going to call this component content. And while I'm at that, I'm going to generate a new component, which I'm just going to call. So if you saw the drive link in the chat, the drive link contains a bunch of old pieces of art, just like art photos. I think the Mona Lisa is in it, American Gothic. So I just downloaded a couple of those images. So the idea of what we're going to do is we're just going to have containers that hold the pieces of art, and we're going to have a list of all of them as our content. So for each of those pieces of art, though, that sort of container it's in, we'll treat as a component. Okay, and I'm going to call it art. So before we go to the content, which you can see both of these files got generated, let's go to this art component. So like I said, all this is going to be is really a div with an image inside of it, and the image is a piece of art. So what we're going to do is, once again, I'm just going to do div id art div. Okay. So now here comes the problem with this. So if you think about, well, in the drive folder, there are several different pieces of art. And so the problem is we're going to need to repeat this component a couple times, I think 6 times. And so the problem is with a component shouldn't be specific. So we want this component to hold an image of a piece of art, but we want it to be open-ended. We don't want it to be a specific image. We want it to be able to be any image, right? So it has to almost be somewhat genericized. But the problem is standard web development doesn't really have a way of doing that. You would really just have to, what you would normally do with it is you would do, okay, so image src, and then whatever the image's location is. And then you'd have to like repeat this again and again and again and again and again. And then for each of these, the source would be different. And that's sort of, it's tedious, and in any situation with Angular, you don't want to do this because Angular has some really cool tricks up its sleeve that make it so that you do not have to do any of this. So let's get rid of all of this right now. And we still have our image source. Now, the problem right now is this source is sort of not fixed, right? We want this source to be able to accept multiple directories to images. So for right now, the question is, what do we put in here? And so luckily, what's really cool about Angular is Angular allows us to put variables in our HTML. And this allows us to make it so that this source is not always just going to be pointing to one image. It has this ability to take any directory that it can. So what we want to do now is go to the Typescript file, which is where all of our logic is. Okay, and our logic here, as you can see, we have a constructor. We also have this function called ng on init. This is a function, a special Angular function that when this component is created, this function will run. So I mean, it kind of acts like a constructor in some sense. But so what we want to do though is make it so that we can, instead of having our image source be fixed, have it so that we can pass, just like how we would pass an input in like normal, maybe like object-oriented code. I want to be able to pass a directory as the source. Now, components have this really awesome feature that you can make it so that components have inputs and outputs. And the way to do this is, so we're gonna create an input for our source image. And the way to do this is right here, we're gonna do @input. And this specifies that what we're about to type is indeed an input. I'll call it image, and I'll give it the type string. Okay, so what this means is this component accepts as an input an image string. And that's actually all the input we really need. We only need this one image. So now the question is, when we accept the input, and I'll show you how to feed this component input, but how do we use this variable in the HTML? Well, luckily, Angular handles this very well. So by default, in order to specify a specific directory, in order to specify a variable in the Typescript file of the corresponding component, we need to use this notation, which is double brackets either way. And then inside of the brackets, we have the name of the variable. Now, you're not going to have to do this for everything because, and I'll explain that in a second, but in this situation, what this is ultimately saying is the image I'm talking about is not a string literal. It's actually talking about a variable. So the problem is if I did this, the HTML wouldn't know what to do. It would think, oh, this is the image directory, just this word image, not the variable. And when we add this double notation here, this double bracket notation, this is telling the Angular compiler, this is not a string literal. We're actually talking about the value of the variable. Although I'll show you once again, in some certain situations, you don't need to have the double bracket, but it's a bit situational. In this case, you do. So this is it right now. I'm going to add some very quick stylings to our art component just so it doesn't look bad. I'll make it, let's make it 50% of the screen. And then the height will just be auto. The image inside of it will make the width 100%. That should hopefully work. Okay. So before we do anything else, if you haven't already, you should download the images from the Google Drive link that I supplied, because we're going to be using them now. So let me actually get those very quickly. And what we're going to do, once you download all those images, you want to drag all those image files into the app assets folder. So let me show that really quickly. Okay. Just give me 1 second. I'm just going to move them into the assets folder. Okay. So now we see in the assets folder, we have multiple, we have our images here. We can see all of them. Okay. Very nice. So now the question is, how do we access these images? So how do we put these images? How do we actually use this component that we created? So let's go into this content component. We'll go to content HTML. And within this content component, we're going to be, this is what's going to be under the header that we created. So once again, I'm just going to create content, div ID content. Okay. So let's add one piece of art, app art. So now the question is, how do we give it input? So the nice thing that we can do is Angular notation, Angular syntax for an input to a component is square brackets around the input's name. So like that. So in our art, we had image as an input. So we put the square brackets around it. That designates it as an input to the component. And we're going to feed it. So by default, any of these tags that have these square brackets, or in other, I'll show you also, parentheses mean output rather than input. And so I'll just leave these. But whenever it's using brackets or parentheses, remember how I showed you that you had to do this, but in any of the cases you're dealing with input or output to a component, these brackets are actually unnecessary for specifying a variable in the TypeScript. And what this means, though, is we actually can't supply this. Like, we can't just type the directory like this. So what is it? Assets. Let's put Mona Lisa. And also a very convenient thing, by the way, is when you're specifying an image, it doesn't matter where your component is in the file structure. You just start the directory with assets and it automatically knows, okay, it's talking about this assets folder here. So it's very convenient. You don't need to do anything like dot dot dash like to go up directories. It's unnecessary. But we can't now, you might think that this would work, like, oh, we pass it the string literal. But the problem is because it's Angular is going to be looking at this and thinking, oh, I'm looking for a variable with this name. So we want to instead give it the string literal, and all we need to do is just surround it by single quotes, and that will fix it. So now, I don't think we added the content component yet to the app component HTML. So let's go there, back again, app component HTML, and let's add our content. Save that. The content component, I'm going to add some styling with, I'll just make the component take up the whole screen. Okay. So let's see what we have back it. Okay, so here's our Mona Lisa image. It's not centered, actually. Let me, for my own sake, let's go back here. I think this should work. Okay, there we go. Let's make it not 40%. Okay, so we have our image, and we can see here that we're getting that from, let's go back to the content, HTML. So this is where it's coming from. But as we know, we have more than just one image. We have several images, right? So the problem is, and I kind of already discussed this before, is that normally in HTML, you would do something like this if you wanted to repeat it. And then for each one of these, you would specify a different image, right? So you can see I did this, and now it's just a bunch of Mona Lisas here. But Angular does something really nice for us in the sense that it has basically a for loop that you can use in HTML. And this allows us to not only repeat objects, but we can iterate over an array. And this array can hold the names of all of our images. And then what we can do is when we're iterating over this array, we'll feed in each individual array element into the image input. So if we go to our content.typescript, I'm going to quickly create an array. So I'll call this images. It's going to be an array of strings. I'm going to initialize it on the ng on init. So with TypeScript, one thing to note, if you're in a class and you're referring to a class instance variable, you have to use the this keyword. You cannot avoid using this, because if I just do images, you're going to see it's going to give me an error. It's not going to find it. So you need to make sure that this keyword is in use. And we're going to set this to, okay, so let me get all the image names. So if we go over here, we have American Gothic.jpg. Actually, they're all .jpegs. I don't need to have that. I'll show you in a second what I'm going to do. Mona Lisa, retrospect, skull, soup can, and then finally Starry Night. Okay. So let's go back to the content HTML. And so what we want to do is we want to iterate over this array. Now the component we want to copy is this app art. So what I'm going to do is add a directive. Oh, did I write Mona list? Yes, I did. Thank you for the catch. Okay. So in order to um, basically iterate over this array, we want to use Angular's Ng4 directive. And so we use the asterisk sign and then Ng4 is equal to. And so now inside of this is basically the iteration. So we're going to define, and I'll explain what I'm writing here, let image of images. So what's happening here is with images, Angular is smart enough to realize I'm talking about this images in our TypeScript component. And then when I do let image of image, what this is basically, it's basically a for each loop where this image, this receiving variable is going to have the each of these strings, right? But what's cool about the Ng4 directive is now we can use this newly created image variable within our component. And so instead of feeding this, we can actually just directly feed it image. Now, one thing you'll notice is in my images, I didn't have the assets like assets or the JPEGs. So what I'm going to do, and I only didn't include them because they're always going to be the same. So what I can do here is add a string literal assets / plus image plus dot JPEG. Save that. I think that should work. Yeah, and that works. So we go back to our web browser and you can see here that all the images load and they're all different. And so it's just taking it from this array that we created and repeating them. And so you can see here that instead of repeating app art 6 times for each of these, this is all of our code. This is it. I mean, it just makes our code so much smaller and so much more bearable to look at instead of having to just repeat that component over and over and over and over again. Okay. So Angular also has another trick up its sleeve. So not only does Angular support for, it also supports, it happens to also support if statements. And if you obviously an if statement takes a Boolean value. And so an ng if statement allows us to conditionally display a part of the website depending on a certain circumstance. Okay, so what we want to do is for example, let's add some sort of new, I'm not going to create a new component of this for the sake of time, but let's make it a div and we're going to use the ng if directive. And let's do, I don't know. So let's go into our content component TypeScript. I'm going to create a Boolean value and I'm just going to call this, I don't know, activated. And it's a Boolean. I'm going to initialize that to false. Let's go back into the component. So ng if, and I'm just going to give it that variable name, activated. And so so basically what this means is if activated is false, everything inside of everything inside of these this div will not show. So if we refresh the page and we go back, you'll see here that if we scroll all the way to the bottom, we don't see that hello world text because of course our Boolean value is false. It's not going to show. If we go back into the TypeScript and I change that false to a true, and we go back and we scroll to the bottom, we can see, although it's really tiny, over at the bottom it says hello world. Of course, this is kind of dumb because we're literally editing the variable inside of our TypeScript. But when you're actually using the website, you're not going to be able to modify the code. So let's instead of having us just manually change this to true or false, let's add a button that toggles it. So let's go back into our HTML and I'm going to add a button. And the button is just going to say press me or something. Okay, there's our button. It doesn't do anything. Uh, let me actually add some stylings for it so they're not all just in the bottom corner. Can't spell today. Let me see how that looks. Okay, there we go. That's good enough for me. Maybe just some padding. All right, so we have our button here. Ignore how bad it looks. It's just, it's not important. What we want to do now is make this button functional. We want to add functionality to the button so that it actually does something. Now, another cool thing Angular has is a lot of very, shortcuts to uh, events occurring. So what's cool is we can just do this. So what this means is, notice that we're using these parentheses. This means it's an output. So click is an output. What this means is when the button is clicked, we're going to have something happen as a result. And what's going to happen is what we put in these quotes over here. So I'm going to create a function in the TypeScript, and we're going to call this function toggle. We'll just call it toggle. It's not important. And toggle is just going to take this dot activated and just give it its opposite value. And so now back in the HTML, I'm just going to feed it the toggle function. And let's go back. And when I press it, oh, it is showing up. It's just, yeah. So when I press it, we see the hello world text shows up. And when I press it again, it disappears. So the cool thing is even though the state of this activated variable keeps changing, the website is actually changing as a result. So it's constantly updating and checking like if this value of activated gets changed. So that's a really cool thing in the sense that Angular's web pages can kind of act dynamically and allow us to change what it looks like based on certain variables in our code. And so we can see that that's just a really nice feature to have. And so, yeah, so the Ng4 directive is very important. Now, maybe we could be a little bit more interesting. And instead of the button always just saying, press me, let's have it say something else. Let's have it say something different depending on the value of activated. So we'll do png-if. This may not be the most efficient way to do it, but I think it'll still look fine. So once again, we'll just use activated as our variable. We'll have another one where instead it's the opposite, so not activated. So if it's not activated, we're going to call it show, and we'll call it hide when it's activated. So let's go back. Let me make the button a little bit higher. Okay, so it says show right now. So when we press it, now it says hide, but now we see that our text is showing. I'll hit hide now, and it disappears. And you can see we can just keep doing this. Okay. So one last thing, because I have 5 more minutes, is I just would like to showcase communicating with different components. So the problem, one sort of big issue with components is this idea that they're independent is important, but that also makes it a little bit difficult to communicate between components. So like if something happens in a different component that may affect other components, how do we get that information to them that something has changed that they need to respond to? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our button that we have put in our content. I'm going to delete, I'm cutting that. So I'm cutting the code, and we're going to go to the header component. And instead, I'm going to put the button there. Right. And it'll probably give me an error because it doesn't, it's not going to know what these functions or anything are because I haven't added them yet. So once again, let's add this activated variable, which is just a Boolean. Initialize it to false. And we'll, once again, let me just go back into the content and I'll just copy the toggle function. Actually, I'll delete that. Okay. So that it should be working now. And you could see there's our button, which once again, I don't really care what it looks like, but notice that when we hit show hide, it doesn't do anything, right? Because this activated variable is not the same as the one in the content. They're not the same, so they're not even linked. But what we need to do is when we press our button in the header, we want the result to be showcased in the content as well. So how do we go about doing this? Well, Angular has these really cool things called emitters. And what emitters do is it allows you to transmit data between like in and out of components. So it can work as an input, as an output. So if we go to our header component, so we want to create an output emitter. And what this means is when this variable gets changed, we want it to emit a signal saying that that happened. So I'm going to do at output. So this is very similar to at input, just with except with at output. And I'll call the output has changed or something. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to initialize it as a new event emitter. For some reason, make sure it imports the Angular core version of it. I don't know why VS Code by default doesn't import that version. So we need to specify an event emitter can take a type. So it can take void. It doesn't have to submit. It can just be a signal that like says something has happened, but it doesn't actually like transfer a variable. But what we want to do is we want this activated value in this component to agree with the one in we want it to agree with the one in the content component. So we're going to transfer a Boolean value. That's what's going to be emitted. And that's all we need to do. Okay, so has changed. So what's going to happen is with this toggle, every time we hit toggle, we're going to emit has changed, emit. And what we're going to do is we're going to feed it. Hang on, I'm going to specify the type so it shows the hint here. Yeah, so emit, and we'll give it this dot activated. So that's the value it's going to be emitting. So let's go to the content. So let's go actually to the app component HTML. And so as I said, this has changed is an output. So we use these parentheses. And so now the question becomes, okay, so now we are going to get a response from the header, and we want to sort of now feed this information into the content component. So what happens basically when this has changed happens? So let's go back into the content component, TS. I'm going to have, instead of this activated, I'm going to just have, we're actually, instead of it being a value we can change, I'm going to make that an input. And then we don't need to initialize it because it's an input. We don't need that toggle anymore. Yeah, so if activated, okay. So let's go into the app component.typescript. I'm going to add an activated variable here as well. Boolean, I'm just going to straight up, without using any constructor, just initialize that to false for the sake of time. And then so for the input of activated, we'll feed it that activated value there. So now the question is, we have this activated variable in our content component, right? But now we need to get it. So what we'll do here is after this has changed, we're going to set it equal to, I think you can just do this. If not, I'll just write a function. And then what we want to do is use $event. And what that ultimately means is this is the value that's being transmitted by the emitter. And so what this is going to do, hopefully, is it will set this activated value in the app component TypeScript. And then therefore, since it's feeding in that value as an input to our app content component, it should have that general effect. So let me refresh. Nothing is showing. So, all right. So then let's not do it this way. Let me go into the TypeScript. And by the way, this is just the last thing we'll be doing. I know I'm a little short on time here. Set activated. It'll take a Boolean value. I'll just call it B. This dot activated is equal to B. And then what we'll do here is in the content component, not content, app component, we'll do set activated, and then we'll feed it the event as the input. Let me refresh. Why is it not liking? Output has changed, not initialized in. Let me see why that's happening. Okay, maybe I'll just initialize it right there. Okay. Okay, there we go. So now, as you can see, our hello world is showing now. Now I'm going to hit hide, and now it's hiding. So even though this is, these two are completely separate components, they're now interacting with each other. And you can see that it's actually having an effect. So in terms of what I wanted to, that's really all I wanted to show of Angular today. But I think the main takeaway I wanted to show here was Angular has this idea of components, which allow you to sort of break down your code into multiple sections so that it's not just one giant file. And the nice thing about components is they can be repeated, they can be genericized so that they can accept variables and so they can have inputs and outputs. You can then use these components multiple times. You can put them in for loops if they need to be repeated again and again and again, instead of just simply copying the code again and again and again. And then also you have these if statements, which allow you to conditionally show certain elements of the HTML on your website. Now, this isn't, by the way, the full extent of what Angular can do. It's very powerful. There's other things I haven't gotten into, like services and routing, which those would just take kind of too much time to discuss. But this is, I think, the overall look at Angular. And I hope that maybe from what I've shown you today, you can kind of see how powerful it can be and just how convenient it can be for making web applications. And I mean, I know I personally love it. I use Angular a lot for my own sort of personal projects, and I find it just to be a very nice way to make web applications. So are there any questions from the chat?
I enabled voice so like people can just talk to you directly.
Cool. So yeah, if you have any questions, you can feel free to talk. Otherwise, if you don't have any questions, that is the end of the workshop. So you can, if you have other workshops to attend to, or you just want to leave, that's perfectly fine. And just